The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the general store in Columbus, New Mexico, and Nora Nordstrom stepped down into the dusty street with her heart hammering against her ribs like a prisoner desperate for escape. It was September 1885, and the relentless sun beat down on her travel-worn dress as she clutched her single carpetbag and surveyed the town that was supposed to become her new home. She had traveled all the way from Pennsylvania after responding to an advertisement seeking a bride for a rancher named Franklin Quinn, a man she had never met but whose letters had been kind enough to convince her that anything was better than the alternative she had left behind. The driver tossed down her trunk without ceremony, and Nora stood there in the middle of the street, looking around for the man who was supposed to meet her. The photograph he had sent showed a stern-faced man with dark hair and strong features, but she had learned long ago that photographs could lie. What mattered was that he had seemed honest in his correspondence, and he had promised her a home and a chance at a new life far from the poverty and shame that had followed her family after her father's debts had consumed everything they owned. A group of women stood outside the mercantile, their heads bent together as they whispered and stared in Nora's direction. She could feel their judgment like needles pricking her skin. Her dress was patched in several places, the fabric faded from too many washings, and she knew she must look like exactly what she was, a desperate woman with no other options. One of the women, a blonde in an expensive green dress that looked entirely out of place in this frontier town, said something that made the others laugh, and Nora felt her cheeks burn. "Miss Nordstrom." A deep voice spoke from behind her, and she turned to find a man approaching from the direction of the livery stable. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled out his worn work shirt. His dark hair needed cutting, and dust covered his boots and the lower half of his pants, but his eyes were a startling blue that seemed to see right through her defenses. This was Franklin Quinn, and he was even more imposing in person than she had imagined. "Mr. Quinn," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she extended her hand. He took it carefully, as though afraid he might break her fingers, and she felt the calluses on his palm that spoke of hard work and long days under the sun. "Call me Frank," he said, and there was something gentle in his tone that did not match his rugged appearance. "I am glad you made it safely. The journey must have been difficult." Before she could respond, the blonde woman from the mercantile group swept toward them, her skirts swishing dramatically. "Why, Frank Quinn, is this the mail-order bride we have all been hearing about?" Her voice dripped with false sweetness, and her green eyes raked over Nora with undisguised contempt. "My goodness, she looks like she has been dragged behind the stagecoach rather than riding in it." Frank's expression hardened, but the woman continued without pause. "I am Pauline Whitmore, dear. My father owns the bank and half the businesses in this town." She looked at Frank with a possessive gleam that made Nora's stomach turn. "Frank and I are old friends, very old friends if you understand my meaning." "Pauline," Frank said, his voice low and warning, "this is not the time or place." "I am simply welcoming the poor thing to Columbus," Pauline said with a laugh that held no warmth. "Though I must say, Frank, I am surprised. After turning down every eligible woman in 3 counties, you send away for some bedraggled charity case from the East. Whatever were you thinking?" Nora felt the humiliation wash over her like scalding water, but before she could form a response, Frank stepped between them. "I was thinking that I wanted a woman with character and courage, not one whose main talent is spreading poison with her tongue. Now, if you will excuse us, I need to get Miss Nordstrom to the ranch before dark." He picked up Nora's trunk as though it weighed nothing and placed it in the back of a sturdy wagon that waited nearby. Then he turned back to Nora and offered his hand to help her up onto the seat. His touch was steady and sure, and she found herself grateful for his presence even though they were still strangers to each other. As Frank climbed up beside her and took the reins, Pauline called out, "Do not get too comfortable, dear. Frank will realize his mistake soon enough." The women with her tittered and whispered, and Nora could feel their eyes following the wagon as Frank guided the horses down the main street. They rode in silence for several minutes, the town falling away behind them as the landscape opened up into rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and the occasional cluster of cottonwood trees. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts, until finally Frank spoke. "I apologize for Pauline. She has had her sights set on being mistress of the Quinn ranch for years, but I have no interest in marrying someone who measures people by the size of their bank account or the newness of their clothes." He glanced at Nora, and she saw sincerity in his blue eyes. "I meant what I wrote in my letters. I am looking for a partner, someone willing to build a life out here. It is not easy and it is not glamorous, but it is honest work and a good life if you are willing to give it a chance." Nora swallowed past the lump in her throat. "Mr. Quinn, I need to be honest with you. I have nothing to offer except my willingness to work hard. My family lost everything before my father died, and I have been working as a seamstress for the past 2 years just to keep a roof over my head. I am not some refined lady who knows how to host dinner parties or play the piano. I responded to your advertisement because I was desperate, and I will understand if you have changed your mind now that you have seen me." Frank was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the reins as the horses plodded along the dusty road. Then he said, "I grew up dirt poor, Miss Nordstrom. My father was a drunk who gambled away every cent he ever earned, and my mother took in laundry to feed us kids. I built my ranch from nothing, working every job I could find and saving every penny until I could buy my first piece of land. I do not care about fancy bloodlines or social connections. I care about finding someone real, someone who understands what it means to work for what you have. From your letters, I thought you might be that person. Was I wrong?" "No," Nora said quietly. "You are not wrong. I want to make this work, Mr. Quinn. I want a chance at a real life." "Then we will make it work," he said firmly. "And call me Frank. We are going to be married after all." No point in standing on ceremony. The directness of his words made her blush, but there was something reassuring about his matter-of-fact approach. This was a business arrangement that might, with time and effort, become something more. She could work with that. She had survived far worse than an uncertain future. The Quinn ranch appeared as they crested a low hill, and Nora felt her breath catch at the sight. It was not a grand estate by any means, but the house was solid and well-maintained, built of adobe with a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. There was a barn, a stable, and several other outbuildings, all showing signs of careful attention. Horses grazed in a nearby pasture, and she could see cattle dotting the hills in the distance. "It is not much," Frank said, and she could hear a note of pride mixed with uncertainty in his voice. "But it is all paid for, every acre and every board. No bank owns a piece of the Quinn ranch." "It is beautiful," Nora said honestly. "It is more than I ever hoped for." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something shift in his expression. "I think we are going to do just fine, Miss Nordstrom." As they pulled up to the house, an older Mexican woman came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She had silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. "You must be Señorita Nordstrom," she said, her accent giving the words a musical quality. "I am Rosa Martinez. I help Señor Frank with the cooking and cleaning. Welcome to the ranch." "Thank you," Nora said as Frank helped her down from the wagon. Her legs were stiff from the long journey, and she stumbled slightly. Frank's hand went immediately to her elbow, steadying her with a gentleness that surprised her given his size and obvious strength. "Rosa has prepared the guest room for you," Frank said. "I thought you might want some time to settle in before we talk about the wedding arrangements. The circuit preacher comes through Columbus once a month, and he is due back next week. If that is too soon, we can wait, but I thought sooner might be better than letting the town gossips work themselves into a frenzy." Nora thought of Pauline Whitmore and her cruel comments. "Next week would be fine," she said. "I see no reason to delay." Frank nodded, looking relieved. "Good. That is settled then. Rosa will show you around and get you anything you need. I have work to finish in the south pasture, but I will be back before supper." He tipped his hat to her and strode off toward the barn, leaving Nora standing there with her carpetbag in hand, watching him go. Rosa chuckled softly beside her. "He is a good man, that one," Rosa said. "A little rough around the edges, perhaps, but he has a good heart. Come, let me show you the house." The interior was simple but clean, with sturdy furniture that looked handmade and whitewashed walls that kept the rooms cool despite the afternoon heat. The guest room was small but comfortable, with a real bed covered in a colorful quilt and a window that looked out over the eastern hills. Someone, probably Rosa, had placed a pitcher of fresh water and a basin on the dresser, along with a small vase of wildflowers. "It is not fancy," Rosa said, echoing Frank's earlier words, "but it is home. Señor Frank, he works very hard to make this place what it is. His father, he was not a good man, and Frank, he was determined to be different. He has succeeded, I think." "How long have you worked here?" Nora asked, setting down her bag and running her hand over the smooth wood of the dresser. "5 years now. My husband, he worked for Señor Frank too, but he passed 2 years ago. Frank, he let me stay even though he did not need so much help anymore. He said this was my home for as long as I wanted it." Rosa's eyes grew misty. "That is the kind of man he is. He takes care of his own." Nora felt a warmth spread through her chest. She had chosen well, even if it had been more desperation than choice that had brought her here. "I am glad to hear it. I want to be a good wife to him, but I hardly know where to start." "You start by being yourself," Rosa said wisely. "And by not letting those town witches poison your mind. I heard what Pauline Whitmore said to you. She has been chasing after Señor Frank for years, but he has no interest. She is angry that he chose you instead of her, so she will try to make trouble. Do not let her." "I will try," Nora said, though she felt the weight of doubt pressing down on her. She had no money, no family, and no connections in this town. What defense did she have against people like Pauline Whitmore? Over the next few days, Nora settled into life at the ranch. She rose early each morning and helped Rosa with the cooking and cleaning, learning the rhythms of the household. Frank was gone most of the day working with his cattle and horses, but he always made it back for supper, where he would sit across from her at the rough-hewn table and ask about her day. The conversations were stilted at first, both of them feeling their way through this strange arrangement, but gradually they began to relax around each other. She learned that Frank was 28 years old, just 6 years older than herself, and that he had built his ranch through sheer determination and backbreaking work. He had 2 ranch hands who helped during the busy seasons, but he preferred to handle most of the work himself. He loved the land with a fierce passion that showed in every word when he talked about his plans for the future. "I want to build the best horse operation in New Mexico territory," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the hills. "People are starting to recognize Quinn horses as quality stock. Give me another 5 years and I will have buyers coming from as far as Texas and Arizona." "You have worked hard for this," Nora said softly. "You should be proud." "I am proud of the ranch," he said. "But a ranch is just land and buildings without someone to share it with. That is why I sent for you. I was tired of coming home to an empty house, tired of eating alone and sleeping alone and having no one to talk to about the dreams I have for this place." He looked at her, his blue eyes serious in the fading light. "I know this is not a conventional courtship, and I know you do not love me yet. Maybe you never will. But I promise you, Nora, I will do everything in my power to be a good husband to you and give you a good life here." The use of her first name sent a flutter through her stomach. "I will do my best to be a good wife," she said. "I may not know much about ranching, but I am a quick learner and I am not afraid of hard work." "I know," he said, and he smiled at her, a real smile that transformed his stern features and made him look almost boyish. "I can see that in you. You have steel in your spine, Nora Nordstrom. I think you are going to surprise a lot of people in this town." The day before the wedding, Frank drove Nora into Columbus to meet with the preacher and to purchase a few supplies. She had hoped to slip in and out of town without attracting much attention. But that hope was quickly dashed when they pulled up in front of the general store and found Pauline Whitmore holding court with a group of women on the boardwalk. "Well, well," Pauline said, her voice carrying clearly across the street. "If it is not Frank Quinn and his little charity project, tell me, dear, has he figured out what a terrible mistake he has made yet?" Nora felt her face flush, but she held her head high as Frank helped her down from the wagon. "Good morning, Pauline," he said coolly. "I hope you are enjoying the weather." "I would enjoy it more if I did not have to witness such a spectacle," Pauline replied. She stepped closer, her expensive perfume cloying in the dry air. "Really, Frank, it is not too late to call this whole thing off. Everyone knows you are just doing this out of pity. The poor thing clearly needed rescuing, and you always did have a soft heart for strays." "Pauline, that is enough," Frank said, his voice hardening. "You have no idea what you are talking about." "Do I not?" Pauline's eyes glittered with malice. "I know that you could have had your pick of any woman in this territory, including myself. Instead, you sent away for some impoverished nobody from Pennsylvania who looks like she has not had a decent meal in months. What are people supposed to think?" "I think," Frank said, stepping closer to Pauline with a dangerous look in his eyes, "that people should mind their own business. And I think you should remember that your father's bank may own half this town, but it does not own me or my ranch. I chose Nora because she is everything you are not: honest, hardworking, and kind. Now, if you will excuse us, we have business to attend to." He took Nora's arm and guided her past the stunned group of women, but Pauline was not finished. "She will never fit in here, Frank. She will never be accepted. You are condemning her to a life of isolation and scorn, all because you are too stubborn to admit you made a mistake." Frank stopped and turned back, and when he spoke, his voice rang out clearly for everyone on the street to hear. "You are mine, Nora. That is all that matters. These people and their opinions mean nothing to me. Let them talk. Let them mock. It changes nothing about how I feel or what I have chosen." The silence that followed was absolute. Nora stared at Frank in shock, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. He had claimed her in front of the whole town, had declared that she mattered more to him than their judgment or their acceptance. No one had ever stood up for her like that before. No one had ever made her feel like she mattered. Pauline's face had gone white, then red with rage. "You will regret this, Frank Quinn. Mark my words." "The only thing I regret," Frank said quietly, "is wasting so many years trying to be polite to someone who does not understand the meaning of the word." He turned back to Nora and said in a gentler voice, "Come on. Let us get this over with so we can go home." Inside the general store, Nora's hands were shaking as she tried to focus on the list of supplies Rosa had given her. The storekeeper, a portly man named Harold Jenkins, was polite but distant, and she could feel his eyes on her as she moved through the aisles. Frank stayed close to her side, his presence a solid comfort in the face of all the whispers and stares. "I am sorry," she whispered to him when they had a moment alone near the back of the store. "I did not mean to cause you problems with the town." "You have not caused me anything," Frank said firmly. "Pauline and her friends have been looking for an excuse to stir up trouble for years. This is not your fault." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, the gesture so unexpected and tender that it brought tears to her eyes. "I meant what I said out there. You are mine now, and I take care of what is mine. No one is going to hurt you while I am around." The tears spilled over, and Nora quickly wiped them away, embarrassed by her show of emotion. But Frank did not seem to mind. He simply handed her his bandana and waited patiently while she composed herself. "I have never had anyone defend me like that," she said when she could trust her voice again. "Thank you." "You do not need to thank me for doing what is right," he said. "Now, let us finish up here. I believe Rosa wanted some of that special flour for the wedding cake she is planning." They completed their shopping and loaded the supplies into the wagon, ignoring the curious looks and whispered comments from the other townspeople. As they prepared to leave, the preacher, a thin man in his 50s named Reverend Samuel Carson, approached them with a warm smile. "Mr. Quinn, Miss Nordstrom," he said, tipping his hat. "I wanted to confirm that we are still on for tomorrow afternoon at the church." "Yes, Reverend," Frank said. 2 o'clock if that still works for you." "Perfect. I look forward to officiating your union." He turned to Nora, and his smile grew even warmer. "Do not let the gossips get to you, my dear. I have known Frank Quinn for many years, and he is one of the finest men I have ever met. If he chose you, then you must be something special indeed." "Thank you, Reverend," Nora said, feeling a rush of gratitude toward this kind stranger. "I will see you both tomorrow," he said, and with another tip of his hat, he was gone. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Nora kept replaying Frank's words in her mind, "You are mine." That is all that matters. They had been spoken in the heat of the moment, a defense against Pauline's cruelty, but they had sounded so sincere. Did he really feel that way about her? Or had he simply been playing the role of protective fiancé to save face in front of the town? As if sensing her thoughts, Frank said, "I meant what I said back there. All of it. I do not care what Pauline or anyone else thinks. I chose you, and I do not regret that choice." "But you barely know me," Nora said, her voice small. "How can you be so sure?" "I know enough," he said. "I know that you had the courage to leave everything familiar and travel halfway across the country for a chance at a better life. I know that you have been working alongside Rosa this past week without complaint, even though ranch work is nothing like what you are used to. I know that you have kind eyes and a gentle way with the horses. That is enough for me. The rest we will learn as we go." Nora felt warmth spread through her chest, chasing away some of the cold fear that had taken root there. "I want to make this work, Frank. I want to be worthy of your faith in me." "You already are," he said simply, and she believed him. The wedding took place the next afternoon in the small white church at the edge of Columbus. Rosa was there, dressed in her Sunday best, along with a few of Frank's ranch hands and their families. Reverend Carson performed the ceremony with dignity and warmth, and when he pronounced them man and wife, Frank kissed Nora gently, his lips barely brushing hers before he pulled back with a look in his eyes that made her knees weak. They held a small reception at the ranch, with Rosa's excellent cooking and a fiddle player Frank had hired from town. It was simple and unpretentious, nothing like the society weddings Nora had occasionally glimpsed back in Pennsylvania, but it was perfect in its own way. These people, few though they were, had come to celebrate with genuine happiness, and Nora felt more welcomed in those few hours than she had in years. As the sun began to set, and the guests departed, Frank took Nora's hand and led her out to the porch. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the evening air was finally starting to cool after the heat of the day. "I want you to know," Frank said quietly, still holding her hand, "that I will not rush you into anything you are not ready for. We are married now, yes, but I want you to feel comfortable here. Your room is yours for as long as you want it." Nora looked up at him, this strong, honorable man who had chosen her despite all the reasons he should not have, and felt something shift inside her heart. "I appreciate that, Frank. But I think perhaps tonight we could just talk, get to know each other better. Would that be all right?" He smiled, that boyish smile that transformed his face. "I would like that very much." They sat on the porch until the stars came out, talking about everything and nothing. Frank told her about his childhood, about the poverty and his father's violence, and how he had sworn to build something better. Nora told him about her own family, about her father's failed business ventures and her mother's death from pneumonia when Nora was 16, and about the loneliness of the years that followed. "I felt like I was disappearing," she admitted. "Like I was just going through the motions of living without actually being alive. When I saw your advertisement, it felt like a lifeline, a chance to become real again." "You were always real," Frank said, his voice rough with emotion. "You just needed someone to see you, and you see me." She asked. "I see you, Nora Quinn," he said, and the sound of her new name on his lips sent a shiver through her. "I see you, and I like what I see very much." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, and they sat like that in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the ranch and the steady beating of each other's hearts. Over the following weeks, Nora settled into her new life with a sense of purpose she had never known before. She learned to ride, though her first few attempts ended with her in the dust and Frank trying hard not to laugh. She helped Rosa with the endless chores that came with running a ranch household. She even began to help Frank with some of the gentler horses, discovering that she had a natural way with them that pleased him immensely. "You are a natural," he told her one morning as she successfully saddled a young mare without assistance. "I think you might have found your calling." "I like working with them," she admitted. "They do not judge or gossip, they just respond to how you treat them." Frank's expression darkened slightly. "Has someone been giving you trouble in town?" "No more than usual," she said, trying to sound casual. The truth was that every trip to Columbus was an ordeal of whispers and pointed looks. Pauline had made it her mission to ensure that Nora was never welcomed into the town's social circles, and most of the women followed Pauline's lead without question. But Nora refused to let Frank see how much it hurt. He had enough to worry about without adding her wounded feelings to the list. But Frank was not fooled. "Nora, look at me." When she did, she saw anger and concern warring in his blue eyes. "If someone is mistreating you, I want to know about it. You are my wife. Your troubles are my troubles." "It is nothing I cannot handle," she said. "Just petty gossip and cold shoulders. I have survived worse." "You should not have to survive it at all," he said fiercely. He pulled her into his arms and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady thump of his heart. They had grown closer over the past weeks, sharing meals and conversations and quiet evenings on the porch. He had kissed her a few more times, sweet, gentle kisses that left her wanting more, but he had kept his promise about not rushing her. Sometimes she wondered if he was waiting for her to make the next move, to show him that she was ready to take their relationship deeper. That night, after supper, Nora made a decision. She had been sleeping in the guest room since the wedding, and Frank had never once pressured her to change that arrangement. But she was tired of sleeping alone. She was tired of the careful distance they maintained. She wanted to be a real wife to this good man who had given her so much. She knocked softly on his bedroom door, her heart hammering with nervousness. When he opened it, he was in his nightshirt, his dark hair tousled and his eyes widening in surprise. "Nora, is something wrong?" "No," she said quickly. "Nothing is wrong. I wanted to, that is, I thought perhaps." She took a deep breath and tried again. "I do not want to sleep alone anymore, Frank. I want to be your wife in every way if you still want me." His eyes darkened with an emotion that made her breath catch. "If I still want you." "Nora, I have wanted you since the moment I saw you step off that stage coach, but I did not want to push you before you were ready." "I am ready now," she whispered. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "Are you sure? Because once we cross this line, there is no going back. You will be mine in every sense of the word." "I want to be yours," she said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "Completely and totally yours." He kissed her then, not the gentle pecks they had shared before, but a deep, passionate kiss that spoke of weeks of restrained desire finally breaking free. She melted into him, her hands fisting in his nightshirt as he pulled her into the room and kicked the door shut behind them. That night, Nora learned what it meant to be truly cherished. Frank was gentle and patient, taking his time to ensure her comfort and pleasure despite his own obvious need. He whispered words of praise and encouragement, telling her she was beautiful and perfect, and everything he had ever wanted. And when it was over and they lay tangled together in the sheets, both breathing hard and covered in a fine sheen of sweat, Nora felt like she had finally come home. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness, the words escaping before she could stop them. Frank went very still beside her, and for a moment she feared she had made a terrible mistake. Then he rolled over and pulled her close, his lips finding hers in a kiss so tender it brought tears to her eyes. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think I have loved you since that first day, when you stood in the street looking so brave and scared at the same time. You have no idea what you mean to me, Nora. You have made this house into a home. You have made my life worth living." They made love again, slower this time, exploring each other with a new intimacy now that the words had been spoken. And when Nora finally drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, she felt a peace she had never known before. The next few months passed in a blur of happiness. Nora threw herself into ranch life with enthusiasm, learning everything she could about horses and cattle and the business of running a successful operation. Frank was an excellent teacher, patient and encouraging even when she made mistakes. They worked side by side during the day and fell into each other's arms at night, their love growing deeper with each passing week. But the situation in town had not improved. If anything, Pauline's campaign against Nora had intensified. Shopkeepers were slow to serve her, women crossed the street to avoid speaking to her, and cruel rumors circulated about why Frank had really married her. Some said she had been a prostitute back east. Others claimed she was running from the law. The stories grew more outlandish and hurtful, but Nora tried to ignore them, focusing instead on her life at the ranch and her growing love for her husband. The breaking point came in early December when Nora went into town alone to pick up a package of supplies that Rosa needed for Christmas baking. Frank had wanted to come with her, but one of the mares was about to foal, and he needed to stay close to the barn. Nora had assured him she would be fine, but she regretted that confidence the moment she stepped into the general store and found Pauline and 3 of her friends blocking the aisle. "Well, if it is not the famous Nora Quinn," Pauline said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How is married life treating you, dear? Has Frank tired of you yet, or is he still playing the gallant hero? Excuse me, Nora said, trying to step around them, but Pauline moved to block her path. We were just discussing you, actually. Wondering how long it would be before Frank came to his senses and realized what a terrible mistake he made. You have to admit, it is rather pathetic. A mail-order bride who cannot even get the townspeople to accept her. You must feel like such a failure. The only failure here, Nora said, finding her voice and her courage, is your inability to accept that Frank chose me instead of you. I am sorry that hurts your pride, Pauline, but it is time you moved on. Pauline's eyes flashed with rage. How dare you speak to me that way? Do you have any idea who I am? My family built this town. We have connections and money and respect. What do you have? Nothing but a husband who felt sorry for you. I have a husband who loves me, Nora said quietly. And that is worth more than all your money and connections combined. Now please move aside. I have shopping to do. For a moment, she thought Pauline might actually strike her. The other woman's face was twisted with fury, and her hand had risen as though to slap. But then Harold Jenkins, the store owner, cleared his throat loudly from behind the counter. Ladies, if there is going to be trouble, I would prefer you take it outside. This is a place of business. Pauline lowered her hand, but her eyes promised retribution. This is not over, she hissed at Nora before sweeping out of the store with her friends in tow. Nora's hands were shaking as she completed her purchases, and Harold's expression was sympathetic as he wrapped her parcels. Do not let Pauline get to you, Mrs. Quinn. She has always been a spoiled brat who cannot stand not getting her way. Frank made the right choice marrying you. Thank you, Nora said, surprised and touched by his kindness. That means more than you know. She carried her parcels out to the wagon, eager to get back to the safety of the ranch, but as she was loading the supplies, she heard a commotion from the direction of the bank. A crowd had gathered, and she could hear shouting and the sound of someone crying. Curiosity and concern overrode her desire to leave, and she walked over to see what was happening. A young Mexican family stood in the street, their few possessions piled in a cart beside them. The woman was weeping while the man argued with someone Nora recognized as Peter Whitmore, Pauline's father and the owner of the bank. An older child, a girl of perhaps 10, clung to her mother's skirts while two younger children sat on the cart, their eyes wide with fear. I just need a little more time, the man was saying, his accent thick and his voice desperate. The drought killed half my herd, but next season will be better. Please, Senor Whitmore, do not take my land. It is all I have. Should have thought of that before you defaulted on your loan, Rodriguez, Whitmore said coldly. The bank is not a charity. You have 48 hours to vacate the property or I will have the sheriff remove you by force. But where will we go? My children, they need a home. Not my problem. You should have been more responsible. Whitmore turned away dismissively, and the crowd began to disperse, most people looking uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Nora felt anger rise in her throat. This was wrong. This family was being thrown out of their home, and no one was doing anything to help. Before she could second-guess herself, she stepped forward. How much does he owe? Whitmore turned, his eyebrows rising when he saw her. I beg your pardon. How much does Mr. Rodriguez owe the bank? I would like to know. That is none of your business, Mrs. Quinn. This is a private matter between the bank and its debtors. If you are conducting this conversation in the middle of the street, it is hardly private, Nora said. How much? Whitmore's face reddened. $200 plus interest. But again, this does not concern you. $200. It was a significant sum, but Nora knew that Frank had been successful this year. His horses had sold well, and he had mentioned having money set aside for emergencies. Would he consider this an emergency? I will pay it, she heard herself say. Consider Mr. Rodriguez's debt paid in full. The crowd went silent. Whitmore stared at her in disbelief. You will pay it with what money? My husband's money. The Quinn Ranch is good for it, as you well know. She hoped Frank would forgive her for making this decision without consulting him, but she could not stand by and watch this family be destroyed. Frank Quinn would never agree to throw away $200 on some Mexican farmer, Whitmore sneered. You are overstepping, woman. Then let us ask him, Nora said, her heart pounding but her voice steady. Send someone to fetch my husband, and we will settle this right now. Whitmore looked like he wanted to argue, but he must have seen something in Nora's expression that gave him pause. He gestured to one of the men standing nearby. Go get Quinn. Let us see what he has to say about his wife's charitable impulses. The wait felt eternal. The Rodriguez family stared at Nora with a mixture of hope and disbelief, and she tried to give them a reassuring smile even though her own nerves were stretched to the breaking point. What if Frank was angry with her? What if he refused to honor her promise? She would look like a fool, and the family would still lose their home. Finally, she heard the sound of hoofbeats, and Frank came riding down the main street at a gallop. He swung down from his horse before it had fully stopped and strode over to where Nora stood, his expression unreadable. What is going on here? He demanded, looking from Nora to Whitmore and back again. Your wife has decided to play the Lady Bountiful, Whitmore said with a sneer. She offered to pay Rodriguez's debt to save him from foreclosure, $200. I told her you would never agree to such foolishness, but she insisted we ask you. Frank turned to Nora, and for a heart-stopping moment she could not read his expression. Then he said, Is that true? Did you promise to pay their debt? Yes, Nora said, lifting her chin. I know I should have asked you first, but there was no time. They were going to lose everything, Frank. Their home, their land, everything. I could not just stand by and do nothing. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his eyes. $200, you said. Plus interest, Whitmore added smugly, which brings the total to $247. Fine. Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather wallet. He counted out the money and handed it to Whitmore. Here is $300. The extra is to cover any future interest or fees you might try to tack on. I want Rodriguez's debt marked as paid in full with a receipt showing the same. Whitmore's smug expression faltered. Now see here, Quinn. You cannot just ride in here and I just did, Frank said flatly. Now, are we done here? I have a ranch to run. Whitmore snatched the money and stalked back toward the bank, his face purple with rage. The crowd began to disperse again, but this time there were murmurs of approval, and several people nodded respectfully to Frank as they passed. The Rodriguez family stood frozen, tears streaming down both the husband's and wife's faces. Senora Quinn, the man said, his voice breaking. How can we ever thank you? You have saved our family. Pay it forward, Frank said simply. When you see someone else in need, help them if you can. That is all the thanks we need. The family thanked them again, their gratitude overwhelming, before loading their meager possessions back into their cart and heading home. When they were gone, Frank turned to Nora. We need to talk, he said, and her heart sank. She had overstepped. She had made a decision involving a significant amount of money without consulting him, and now he was angry. He helped her into the wagon in silence and climbed up beside her. They rode out of town without speaking, and Nora felt her anxiety growing with each passing minute. Finally, when they were well away from prying eyes, Frank pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her. Nora, what you did back there, he began, and she rushed to interrupt. I am sorry. I know I should have consulted you first. I just could not bear to see that family destroyed when we had the means to help them. If you are angry, I understand. It was your money, and I had no right. I am not angry, Frank said, cutting off her rambling apology. I am proud of you. She stared at him in shock. You are proud and amazed and more in love with you than I thought possible. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. Do you have any idea how incredible you are? You stood up to Peter Whitmore, one of the most powerful men in this territory, to save a family you did not even know. You risked looking foolish and being rejected, all because you could not stand by and watch an injustice. That takes courage, Nora. Real courage. I thought you would be furious with me for spending so much money without asking, she admitted, her voice muffled against his shirt. It is our money, he said firmly. You are my wife, my partner. What is mine is yours, and even if it was not, I would never fault you for having a generous heart. That is one of the things I love most about you. Relief flooded through her, followed by a wave of love so strong it almost hurt. She pulled back enough to look up at him, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. I love you so much, she whispered. I did not know it was possible to love someone this much. He kissed her then, deep and passionate, right there on the road where anyone could see. And Nora did not care. Let the whole world see how much Frank Quinn loved his mail-order bride. She was done hiding and done being ashamed. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Frank rested his forehead against hers. You know this is going to make things worse with Pauline and her crowd. They already hate you, and now you have humiliated her father in front of the whole town. I know, Nora said. But I am tired of caring what they think. You said it yourself that first day, I am yours, and that is all that matters. Damn right you are mine, he said fiercely, and heaven help anyone who tries to hurt you. True to Frank's prediction, the incident with the Rodriguez family did indeed make things worse with the Whitmores and their social circle. But it also earned Nora unexpected allies. Several of the Mexican families who worked as laborers and ranch hands in the area made a point of greeting her warmly when she came to town. Harold Jenkins at the general store started giving her better prices and throwing in little extras with her purchases. Even Reverend Carson made a point of mentioning her generosity in his next sermon, though he was careful not to name names. Christmas came and went in a flurry of celebration at the ranch. Rosa outdid herself with the cooking, and Frank gave Nora a beautiful bay mare that had been bred from his best stock. She is yours, he told her as Nora stroked the mare's soft nose in wonder. I have been training her special just for you. Her name is Morning Star. She is perfect, Nora breathed, throwing her arms around Frank's neck. Thank you, I love her. Not as much as I love you, he said, kissing her soundly. Nora gave Frank a new saddle that she had commissioned from the leatherworker in town. Using money she had earned from selling some of the lace collars and cuffs she had been making in her spare time. His old saddle was worn almost through in places, and she knew he needed a new one even if he was too frugal to buy it himself. When he unwrapped it, his eyes went wide. Nora, this must have cost a fortune. How did you? I earned it, she said proudly. Rosa helped me find customers in town who wanted fancy lacework for their best dresses and blouses. I have been saving the money for months. He ran his hands over the fine leather, his expression awed. This is the finest saddle I have ever owned. Thank you. His voice was rough with emotion. Thank you for being exactly who you are. They spent a quiet evening by the fire, just the two of them, talking about their plans for the coming year and the future they were building together. Frank mentioned wanting to expand the horse operation and maybe hire another hand or two. Nora talked about her dream of starting a small business selling her lacework, maybe even opening a shop in town someday. I think you could do anything you set your mind to, Frank said, pulling her close against his side. You have already accomplished so much since you came here. You turned yourself from a city girl who had never seen a horse up close into a capable ranch woman who can ride and rope and help deliver a foal. You have earned the respect of people in this town, even though Paulin and her crowd tried their hardest to tear you down. You are amazing, Nora Quinn. I had a good teacher, she said, kissing his jaw, and a good husband. I am the lucky one, he insisted. I sent for a mail-order bride and got so much more. I got a partner, a friend, and the love of my life all wrapped up in one beautiful package. As winter gave way to spring, Nora began to suspect that she might be pregnant. She waited until she was sure before telling Frank, choosing a quiet evening after supper when they were alone on the porch. Frank, I have something to tell you, she began, suddenly nervous even though she knew he would be happy. He immediately looked concerned. What is it? Are you all right? I am fine. Better than fine, actually. She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. We are going to have a baby. You are going to be a father. The look on his face was everything she could have hoped for and more, pure joy mixed with wonder and just a touch of fear. A baby, are you sure? I am sure. Rosa helped me figure it out. She says the baby should come sometime in August if her calculations are correct. Frank pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. A baby, he kept repeating. We are going to have a baby. Nora, you have made me the happiest man alive. You are not worried? She asked. About the delivery, about everything that could go wrong. Of course I am worried, he admitted. But I am also excited. We are going to be parents, Nora. We are going to have a family. He pulled back and cupped her face in his hands. I promise you, I am going to be the best father I can be. I am going to be everything my own father was not. I know you will, she said, tears streaming down her face. I already know you will be wonderful. The news of Nora's pregnancy spread through the town quickly, as news always did in small communities. Most people were genuinely happy for the young couple, but Paulin, predictably, had nothing kind to say. I heard the Quinn girl is pregnant, she said loudly at the mercantile one afternoon when Nora was shopping. I suppose that explains why Frank married her in such a hurry. Probably had no choice in the matter. Nora, who was now visibly showing at 5 months along, turned to face Paulin directly. Frank married me because he chose to, Paulin, and I got pregnant after we were married, not before. But even if it had been the other way around, it would be none of your business. Now, if you will excuse me, I have shopping to finish. She walked past Paulin with her head held high, ignoring the other woman's sputtered protests. Harold Jenkins gave her an approving nod as she approached the counter with her purchases. Good for you, Mrs. Quinn. That woman needs to be put in her place more often. As summer arrived and Nora's belly grew rounder, Frank became increasingly protective. He insisted she stop riding, even though she felt perfectly capable. He hovered whenever she did any kind of physical work, ready to swoop in and take over at the slightest sign of fatigue. It was both endearing and occasionally frustrating. Frank, I am pregnant, not made of glass, she told him one afternoon when he tried to stop her from hanging laundry. Women have been having babies for thousands of years while still doing their daily work. I know, he said, looking sheepish. I just worry about you, about both of you. She softened and went to him, wrapping her arms around his waist as best she could with her swollen belly between them. We are going to be fine. Rosa has delivered dozens of babies and she says everything is progressing normally. You do not need to worry so much. I cannot help it, he said, resting his hand on her stomach. You and this baby are my whole world. Their son was born on a sweltering night in mid-August, after a labor that lasted nearly 20 hours. Frank paced the floor outside their bedroom while Rosa and a midwife from town attended to Nora. When the baby's first cry finally pierced the air, Frank nearly broke down the door in his haste to get inside. Nora lay exhausted but radiant in the bed, holding a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Frank, come meet your son," she said, her voice hoarse from hours of screaming. Frank approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the tiny red-faced infant in Nora's arms. "He is perfect," he whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "Absolutely perfect. You want to hold him?" Nora asked, and carefully transferred the baby into Frank's large, work-roughened hands. Frank held his son like he was the most precious thing in the world, staring down at the tiny face with an expression of absolute wonder. "Hello, little one," he murmured. "I am your daddy, and I promise I am going to take care of you and your mama for the rest of my life." They named him Henry Frank Quinn, Henry after Nora's grandfather, who had been one of the few bright spots in her difficult childhood. Frank took to fatherhood with the same dedication he brought to everything else, changing diapers and walking the floor with Henry during the night so Nora could rest. He was so gentle with the baby, this big rough cowboy cradling his tiny son with infinite care. When they took Henry into town for the first time to have him baptized, the whole community turned out. Even some of Pauline's former allies made a point of coming to congratulate them and coo over the baby. Pauline herself was noticeably absent, but Nora found she did not care. She had everything she needed right here: her husband, her son, and a growing circle of true friends who valued her for who she was. The Rodriguez family, whose farm Frank and Nora had saved, brought gifts of food and a beautiful hand-carved cradle that Miguel Rodriguez had made himself. "For the son of the people who saved our family," he said, his eyes shining with gratitude. Life settled into a new rhythm with the baby. Nora learned to balance caring for Henry with helping manage the ranch, and Frank continued to build his horse breeding operation into one of the most respected in the territory. They worked together, loved together, and built a life that was far richer than either of them had ever imagined possible. When Henry was 6 months old, Nora discovered she was pregnant again. This time Frank's reaction was pure joy without the fear, and they welcomed their second son, James, the following summer. 2 years after that came their daughter Margaret, named for Frank's mother who had died when he was young. As their family grew, so did their standing in the community. Frank's reputation for honesty and fair dealing made him a respected voice in local affairs, and Nora's kindness and generosity had won over even some of her harshest critics. The Quinn Ranch became known as a place where people could come for help if they needed it, and both Frank and Nora took pride in being able to support their neighbors. Pauline eventually married a wealthy rancher from Arizona and moved away, much to everyone's relief. Her father sold the bank and retired, and new leadership brought a more compassionate approach to lending and foreclosures. The town of Columbus continued to grow and prosper, and the Quinns were proud to be part of that growth. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Frank took Nora back to the spot where they had first kissed as a married couple, on the road just outside of town. The children were home with Rosa, giving them a rare afternoon alone together. "You ever regret it?" Frank asked, holding her hand as they stood looking out over the land. "Answering my advertisement, coming out here to marry a stranger." Nora looked up at the man who had become her whole world. His dark hair was shot through with a little gray now, and there were lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, but he was still the most handsome man she had ever seen. More importantly, he was still the kindest, most honorable man she knew. "Not for a single second," she said honestly. "That day I stepped off the stagecoach was the first day of my real life. Everything before that was just waiting for you. "I love you, Nora Quinn," he said, pulling her into his arms. "From that first moment in the dusty street to this moment right now, you have been the best thing that ever happened to me." "I love you too," she said, rising on her toes to kiss him. "Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for defending me when the whole town wanted to mock me. Thank you for saying I was yours and that was all that mattered." "It was all that mattered," Frank said fiercely. "It still is. You are mine and I am yours, and nothing else matters as much as that." They stood there together as the sun began to set. Two people who had started as strangers brought together by desperation and circumstance, who had built something beautiful and lasting through courage, hard work, and love. The mail-order bride who had been mocked by the town had found her place, not because the town finally accepted her, but because she had found something far more valuable. A man who loved her unconditionally and a family she could call her own. As they rode back to the ranch as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Nora reflected on how far she had come. She had arrived in Columbus with nothing but a carpetbag and a heart full of desperate hope. Now she had 3 beautiful children, a thriving ranch, genuine friends, and most importantly, a husband who cherished her beyond measure. The years continued to pass in a blur of happiness and hard work. Henry grew into a serious young man who loved the horses as much as his father did. James was more adventurous, always getting into scrapes and coming home covered in dirt. Margaret was bright and determined, with her mother's kind heart and her father's stubborn streak. Frank expanded the ranch, buying adjacent land as it became available, until the Quinn spread was one of the largest in southern New Mexico. But success never changed him. He remained the same honest, hard-working man Nora had fallen in love with, always ready to help a neighbor in need or stand up for what was right. Nora's lacework business grew too, and she eventually did open a small shop in Columbus, employing several local women to help with the intricate work. The money she earned went into a fund for the children's education and for helping families in need, continuing the tradition of generosity that had started with the Rodriguez family. They faced hardships too, as all couples do. There were droughts that threatened the cattle and harsh winters that tested their endurance. Frank broke his leg in a riding accident when Henry was 12, and Nora had to manage the ranch for several months while he recovered. Margaret came down with scarlet fever when she was 7, and they spent 2 terrifying weeks not knowing if she would survive. But they faced every challenge together, their love growing stronger through each trial. When Henry turned 18, he announced his intention to study veterinary medicine back east. Frank was disappointed not to have his eldest son taking over the ranch immediately, but he supported the decision. "A man has to follow his own path," he told Nora. "I will not make the mistake my father made, trying to force my children into a mold that does not fit them." James, meanwhile, showed every sign of becoming a talented rancher, and he worked alongside Frank with enthusiasm and skill. Margaret declared her intention to become a teacher, and both Frank and Nora encouraged her ambitions. As their children grew and began to make their own way in the world, Frank and Nora found themselves with more time for each other. They took long rides across their land, talking and dreaming the way they had in the early days of their marriage. They sat on the porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching the sunset, comfortable in the silence of 2 people who knew each other completely. "You remember that first day?" Nora asked one evening as they sat together, her head resting on Frank's shoulder. "When Pauline said those cruel things and you told me I was yours, and that was all that mattered." "I remember every detail of that day," Frank said, kissing the top of her head. "I remember thinking that I had to protect you, that I could not let them break your spirit the way the world had tried to break mine when I was young. You did protect me, Nora said softly. You gave me a place to belong, a family to love. You gave me everything. We gave each other everything, Frank corrected. You made me believe in love again. You made this ranch into a home. You gave me 3 amazing children and a life I never dreamed I could have. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear one by one in the vast New Mexico sky. Rosa had passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 years earlier, but her memory lived on in the recipes she had taught Nora and the stories she had told the children. The Rodriguez family still lived on their farm, prospering now, and Miguel's oldest son was courting Margaret, much to Frank's mixed feelings about his little girl growing up. As Nora looked around at the life they had built together, she felt a profound sense of gratitude and contentment. She thought about that frightened young woman who had stepped off the stage coach all those years ago, desperate for a fresh start and terrified of being rejected. She wished she could tell that young woman that everything was going to be all right, that the harsh words and cruel judgment would fade away, replaced by love and belonging and a purpose greater than she had ever imagined. The ranch continued to thrive under Frank's expert management and Nora's business sense. They added a new barn and expanded the breeding program to include cattle as well as horses. They employed several families who lived on the property in small houses Frank had built, creating a community of their own. When Frank's 50th birthday arrived, Nora organized a celebration that brought together everyone whose lives had been touched by the Quinns over the years. The Rodriguez family came, of course, along with dozens of other families they had helped through the years. Harold Jenkins came from town, now retired from the mercantile. Reverend Carson, grown old and gray but still sharp as ever, gave a beautiful blessing over the meal. As Frank stood before the assembled crowd, his arm around Nora's waist and his children gathered near, he was visibly moved by the outpouring of affection and respect. "I am not much for speeches," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "but I want to thank all of you for being here today. This ranch, this family, this community we have built together, it means everything to me. But none of it would have been possible without the woman standing beside me." He turned to Nora, his blue eyes still as intense as they had been that first day. 25 years ago, you stepped off a stagecoach and into my life, and you changed everything. You made me believe in love and family, in the possibility of building something good and lasting. Every good thing I have, I owe to you. I love you, Nora Quinn, more today than I did yesterday and less than I will tomorrow. Nora felt tears streaming down her face as she looked up at her husband. I love you too, Frank. You saved my life in every way a person can be saved. You are my hero, my partner, my best friend, and the love of my life. They kissed to the applause and cheers of their friends and family, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built a love story for the ages. As the sun set on that perfect day, Nora stood on the porch of the ranch house and looked out over the land that had become her home. The wind whispered through the cottonwood trees, carrying the laughter of her grandchildren playing in the yard. Henry had come home from his veterinary practice back east with his new wife, a sweet girl named Sarah, who fit into the family as though she had always been there. James was courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher, and Margaret was teaching at the school in Columbus while still being courted by Miguel Rodriguez's son. Frank came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on top of her head. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how blessed we are," she said, leaning back against his solid warmth. "About how different my life could have been if I had not found the courage to answer your advertisement all those years ago." "I am glad you did," Frank said. I am glad you took that leap of faith, glad you survived the mocking and the cruelty, glad you stayed and fought for us when it would have been easier to run away." "I had something worth fighting for," Nora said. "I had you." As the stars began to appear in the twilight sky, Frank and Nora stood together in the place they had built, surrounded by the evidence of their love and labor. They had started with nothing but hope and determination, and they had created a legacy that would endure for generations. The mail-order bride who had been mocked by the town had proven them all wrong. She had not failed or fled or crumbled under the weight of their judgment. Instead, she had thrived, building a life of meaning and purpose alongside a man who saw her true worth when no one else did. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not the opinions of small-minded people like Paul and Whitmore, not the whispers and the rumors and the cruel jokes. What mattered was the love between two people who had chosen each other and refused to let the world tear them apart. As they walked back into the house together, hand in hand as they had been for 25 years, Nora knew that she would make the same choice 1,000 times over. The journey had been hard, the obstacles many, but the destination had been worth every tear, every struggle, every moment of doubt. She was Nora Quinn, wife to Frank, mother to Henry and James and Margaret, grandmother to a growing brood of beautiful children, respected businesswoman, and pillar of the Columbus community. But more than all of those things, she was loved. Truly, deeply, unconditionally loved by a good man who had seen past her worn dress and empty pockets to the strength and courage underneath. And that love had made all the difference. It had transformed a desperate mail-order bride into a confident, capable woman who knew her own worth. It had turned a lonely ranch into a thriving home filled with laughter and life. It had proven that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings can lead to the most beautiful endings. As Nora settled into bed that night beside her husband, feeling the familiar warmth of his body next to hers, she whispered a prayer of thanksgiving for the blessed life she had been given. Then she closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep, safe in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring more of the same joy, more of the same love, more of the same blessed partnership that had sustained them through a quarter-century of marriage. The mail-order bride had found her happy ending, not because the town finally accepted her, but because she had learned the most important lesson of all: when you are loved by the right person, nothing else matters. Frank had told her that on their very first day together, and it had proven to be the truest words ever spoken. She was his and he was hers, and that was all that mattered, now and forever.